Initially, the catastrophe went unnoticed. It started with a week of unrelenting rain, and soon, extensive flooding was reported across the globe. The capital of Elephant Nation was hit with a once-in-a-century downpour, submerging vast shantytowns. In the United States, the subway system experienced its deadliest flooding disaster in 30 years. Even the Antarctic research stations found themselves under a 3-day hailstorm. The news carried a heavy, apocalyptic tone. I frowned, peering into the blank sky outside. All I could see was a sheet of white, nothing else. Had the rain finally stopped, or was it just taking a breather? By evening, a semblance of order returned to our community. The supermarket within the complex reopened, but the absence of rain did little to lift the oppressive mood. My fear of water made me think twice, and my mind drifted to that rain that lasted for 2 million years. For a moment, I paused, then I slipped on my rain boots and hurried to the supermarket. Although the store was packed, most of the shoppers were children, a sign that not everyone was taking the situation seriously. They still wanted to buy groceries, believing the rain had stopped. I quickly began my real shopping spree. I stocked up on hundreds of bags of chicken wings and drumsticks, 50 packs of ham sausages, 30 boxes of biscuits, 20 bags of bread, and 2 crates of bottled water. I also bought flashlights, batteries, power banks, and other essentials to prepare for a potential power outage. The supermarket staff stared in disbelief as I loaded up, but I ignored them and made trip after trip, moving all my supplies back to my apartment. It would last me 2 or 3 months, if I rationed it carefully. I also had a large bag of rice at home, which would last even longer without a power outage. Next, I visited the pharmacy and stocked up on various medications like Imodium and Pepto-Bismol for diarrhea and other common ailments. But despite all these preparations, I still didn't feel secure. My biggest fear was the water level rising to my 3rd-floor apartment. I then reached out to a person in our owners group who had bought a place in our building but lived elsewhere, only returning every 2 or 3 years. His apartment, 3102 on the 31st floor, was often rented out, and he frequently posted rental notices in the group. I told him I had a tenant for him and offered my services as a middleman for a small fee. He gladly agreed, and we settled on a rent of $3,500 per month for 3 months. The property management even sent someone to hand over the keys to me. I then began moving my supplies to the 31st floor, running up and down the stairs. A few neighbors asked what I was doing, and when I told them I was moving supplies to exchange with neighbors for money, they stopped questioning me. By 9 p.m., I had finished moving everything. Exhausted but determined, I checked the doors and windows one last time. Now, holed up on the 31st floor with a room full of supplies, I finally breathed a sigh of relief. The sound of raindrops hitting the windows was relentless, like the devil's tentacles reaching out to the earth. The rain had returned, even more intense than before. Despite my meticulous preparations, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The entire community was in chaos. Owners who had just moments before been outside rushed back home. The property management issued a notice immediately, urging everyone to stay indoors and secure their doors and windows. The owners' group was a flurry of complaints and concerns. Didn't the meteorological service say it wouldn't rain anymore? They asked. I just managed to grab some meat and was rushing home, and now this? Our garage is still flooded, and now it's pouring again. If this keeps up, even the 1st floor will be submerged. As I expected, by 2 a.m., amidst the noisy downpour, there were faint cries and curses, audible even from the 31st floor. The 1st floor was definitely flooded, and the commotion in the corridors indicated that the first-floor residents were fleeing to higher levels. The higher-floor owners were proactive in helping, some saving furniture, others offering shelter to those from lower floors. The spirit of mutual aid was palpable in the group, but I was preoccupied with the news from across the country. Twitter was ablaze with news of the nationwide rainstorms. Most cities were experiencing non-stop rain, like our Yucheng, which had started and stopped repeatedly. The top trending topic was an expert's prediction that the nationwide deluge could lead to a once-in-a-century flood in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River. The situation in the economic hubs of the North, New York, and Los Angeles was also dire. For instance, LaGuardia Airport in New York was completely submerged, and the Hudson River was flooded. Large areas in New Jersey, the Bronx, and other places were paralyzed, and even the capital was not spared. The drainage systems had failed, and half the city was submerged in rainwater. These reports chilled me to the bone. Initially, Yucheng was the focus of the trending topics, but now it was just one of many cities in crisis. The torrential rain was too fierce for anyone to handle. My sense of crisis was not just due to my water phobia but also the catastrophic news from all over the country. I couldn't help but think of that rain that lasted for 2 million years. The current downpour defied logic, and it might signal a mass extinction event. I hurriedly searched the internet for information, focusing on two questions: what if the rain continued for a month, 3 months, or even a year, and how could I save myself? After hours of searching, I found no detailed answers on self-rescue. It seemed the only option was to stay high and dry. If the rain continued, the consequences would be dire. In about half a month, power outages and internet disruptions would occur due to damaged infrastructure, and many people would fall ill due to the damp conditions. In about a month, low-lying areas would be submerged, and massive floods and landslides would break out. 2 months later, small-scale famines would begin, with people dying of starvation. By 4 months, infectious diseases would spread, and by 6 months, many animals and plants would die, and low-altitude areas would be submerged. By the end of a year, except for high-altitude regions and mountains, there might be no land left on Earth. The horror was overwhelming, and I couldn't stop myself from imagining what would happen if the rain continued for months or a year, and what about my parents? I quickly called my parents. Fortunately, there was still a signal. As soon as my dad answered, he said, "Son, the weather is abnormal. I think we should head to the mountains. Wunyang Mountain is over 2,000 meters high, and there are caves for shelter. The village was flooded the day before yesterday, and landslides killed many people." My dad's voice choked with tears, and I was frantic. "Why didn't you tell me earlier? I was worried about you. It seems things are tough there too. I saw on the news that many communities in your area are flooded." I reassured him that I was on the 31st floor and suggested they gather the villagers, take food and drink, and head to Wunyang Mountain for shelter. My dad agreed and suggested I find a chance to join them. Wunyang Mountain, being the highest peak in Yucheng, would never flood. His words sparked a realization. If I could hide in the caves on Wunyang Mountain, the 2,000-meter elevation would be safe from the floods. Plus, Wunyang Mountain is a scenic area with steps leading up and buildings on the mountaintop and waist, making it an ideal refuge. But for now, I couldn't leave. Everywhere was flooded, and without a boat, it was impossible to escape. Moreover, my 31st floor apartment was over 100 meters high. It would be difficult for the water to reach that level unless the rain continued for months. I reassured my dad that I was safe for now and promised to head to Wunyang Mountain if the opportunity arose. After hanging up, I was mentally exhausted from the overwhelming anxiety and fear. I cooked some food to fill my stomach, took a hot shower, and crawled into bed, knowing it would be a sleepless night. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a nightmare, and the sound of the furious rain was the first thing I heard. The rain roared like heaven's wrath, accompanied by howling winds that slammed against the windows. The building was relatively quiet now, with everyone exhausted from the previous night's chaos. Those from the lower floors had sought refuge in the homes of those on higher floors. I patted my face, stepped into the living room, and found it covered in a layer of rainwater. Water was leaking from a corner of the ceiling, and the gaps in the windows allowed rain to seep in. This was the downside of living on the top floor. These kinds of torrential rains made it almost impossible for the penthouse not to leak. Thankfully, the building had good drainage, and the rainwater wouldn't accumulate too much. Still, it was frustrating to see. I moved all my food into the bedroom to protect it from the rain, but there was nothing I could do about the living room. The group chat was in disarray, with people desperate for food and lamenting the destruction of their homes. Despite the chaos and sorrow, neighbors continued to help each other and wait for rescue. But I couldn't help but think that when food became scarce, houses were damp, and the sick were everywhere, the entire building could turn into a living hell.